Well, hello, and thank you very much indeed for joining this Sussex Ornithological Society talk. I'm Mark Mallew. Today's guest speaker is somebody who's made a tremendous contribution to nature conservation in Sussex and the southeast of England, Jim Glover. Jim's an ecologist who spent 31 years working for the RSPB on the management of their nature reserves, but especially also on the establishment of new reserves. And I'm sure that almost all of you have visited one or more reserves that Jim was instrumental in creating. He's had a long and very close association with the Aran Valley, and he's generously agreed to share some of his knowledge with us this evening. And this talk also honours a close colleague of Jim's, but I'll leave him to say more about that. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jim.
Hello. All right, I'm sorry, I've obviously pressed the wrong button.
You need to share that green share screen.
Right.
Yep, that's good.
And if I press play,
you're good to go.
Hopefully it will work. How's that? This talk is about 3 nature reserves between the villages of Pulborough and Amberley in the Aran Valley. I will explain how the wildfowl interest was nearly lost, a brief history of the 3 nature reserves, and in particular my involvement with Pulborough Brooks, how the 3 reserves together became an internationally important wetland for birds and other wildlife, and future challenges. A key figure in this story was Tim Calloway, who I appointed as a site manager for Pulborough Brooks Reserve in 1990. Tim died tragically and prematurely last year on New Year's Eve, and this talk is dedicated to his memory. This is the Aran Valley catchment area, which covers a large part of Sussex, but in this talk I will focus mainly on 3 small areas of the floodplain between Pulborough and Amberley that have been acquired and managed as nature reserves over the last 58 years. They're shown here by the duck, which is just below where the River Rother, which starts near Petersfield, joins with the Aran, which starts near Horsham. The reserves are shown in this map. Number 1, Pulborough Brooks at the top. Numbers 2 and 3 are the respective reserves at Amberley Wildbrooks owned by the SWT and the RSPB, and number 4 on the left to the west. Together, they are known as the Aran Valley SPA. For many years, these reserves have held 4 important conservation designations from the government agency Natural England. These are SSSI, SPA, Ramsar and SAC. These designations are very important because they should trigger government funding and protection priorities. A brief explanation of these designations may be useful here. SSSIs are sites of special scientific interest, the most important sites for nature conservation in the UK, designated by the government agency Natural England. SPAs are special protection areas, and only a very small number of SSSIs, which hold nationally and formerly European important numbers of birds. The EU used to hold our government to account for these sites, and we should be concerned that our government may not give them the same protection in future. Ramsar sites are sites of international importance for wetland birds. It was a treaty originally signed in the village of Ramsar in Iran, committing signatories to protecting sites holding more than 20,000 wetland birds. And finally, SACs are special areas for conservation, which is a European and nationally important site for wildlife other than birds, only applicable in this case to Amberley Wildbrooks and Pulborough Brooks due to a rare Whirlpool Snail. For 21 years, Pulborough Brooks and Amberley Wildbrooks were the only nature reserves in Sussex with all these designations. In addition to this unique status, there was a study carried out in the 1990s by students of Professor John Lawton of the Imperial College London. They added up all the published records from atlases of flora and fauna for the 10 kilometre square shown here as TQ01. with the 3 reserves shown with ducks. And they compared it with all the other 10 kilometre squares in the UK, and they concluded it was one of the most, if not the most, biodiverse square in the whole of the UK. So why is it important? Well, the south of England is generally more biodiverse because of the milder climate. There are a remarkable number of very different habitats: chalk grassland, acid heathland, wet grassland, flower meadows, streams, rivers, parkland, and ancient woodland, and even a raised peat bog in the middle of Amberley Wildbrooks. It also has a very varied water pH. Amberley Wildbrooks is fed by chalk springs running off the south and greensand to the north and east, resulting in a remarkable variation of water acidity or water pH, which in turn supports an impressive variety of associated flora and fauna. Observer bias: many naturalists have studied wildlife in this area, and it's close to London. And for example, Mary Briggs was a well-known botanist who lived in Pulborough. In view of observer bias, it's not surprising there's nobody. It justifies the title of this talk, "The Most Important Wildlife Site in Sussex." I should just add that in 2019, Chichester Harbour was designated as part of the Solent Marine SAC, and so it now has all 3 international designations and is therefore of equal status. In any event, all that really matters is that the Aran Valley is a wonderful area, and we should all be grateful that these 3 reserves have been preserved by the efforts of the SWT, the RSPB, and with the help of the SOS. Let's now look at a brief history of the Aran Valley north of the Downs. For millennia, river floodplains like the Aran Valley has been valued by farmers as highly productive land. Winter flooding would bring nutrient-rich sediments washed down by the river and deposited over the floodplain meadows, enriching the soil. Floodwater would also insulate the soil and keep it warmer than the surrounding area, so that as soon as the water drained away in spring, the grasses and many other plants would grow more quickly, and so the grazing livestock would thrive. In addition to livestock, large numbers of wintering and migrating wetland birds would feed on the meadows and roost on open water, and they have always been associated with this traditional wet grassland management. I took this poor photograph on my phone through my telescope. It's part of a mixed flock of more than 2,000 duck roosting on one flooded pool at Amberley just over a month ago. Now, the only problem from the farmer's point of view was that they could not control when the flooding would occur, and so in the 1960s and 1970s, the River Board decided to build raised embankments along parts of the River Aran with sluices which could control flooding. These new embankments worked well, keeping water off the brooks, but the problem was that when the river overtopped the embankment, the brooks would fill but could not drain away until the river level was low enough. Flooding would therefore persist if the tides and rainfall kept the river high. So, in 1977, there was a proposal to pump drain Amberley Wildbrooks to reduce this problem and to make it more productive for arable farming. Incidentally, you can see in this extensive flooding of Amberley Wildbrooks, the raised area, peat bog area in the middle forms an island. So let's look at the story of Amberley Wildbrooks and the public inquiry. It was, press one button too soon. It was the Southern Water Authority who submitted a request for grant aid from the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries to install drainage pumps in 1977. Local residents and conservationists objected, and there was an inquiry in 1978 which concluded that the project should not be grant-aided with public money. This was a landmark decision that was celebrated by conservationists throughout the country. However, although the inquiry was widely regarded as a conservation victory, it turned out that by enlarging sluices and deepening ditches, land managers were able to gravity drain the Wildbrooks quite effectively, resulting in a steady decline of both wintering and breeding water birds. This decline was really well illustrated with 2 graphs which were produced by Tim Calloway in 2002. This first graph shows breeding waders, lapwing and redshank, in the Aran Valley. Counts were not made every year, but this graph shows 4 counts between 1982 and 2001, and you can see a significant decline in wader numbers on the Amberley Wildbrooks, which is the dark area, and Pulborough brooks the numbers increased at Pulborough after the acquisition. However, the total number of waders has declined significantly over the last 20 years. This second graph is even more striking. It shows wintering widgeon numbers in the valley from 1957 to 2002. You can clearly see that widgeon disappeared from Pulborough after the construction of the Pulborough embankment in 1967, which I have marked with a number 1 at the bottom. Then they disappeared from Amberley after the embankment construction there in 1975, marked as number 2. You can also see from the graph that there was a period of some 14 years when widgeon numbers remained very low in the valley until the purchase of Pulborough brooks, marked number 3 by the RSPB, at which time numbers rapidly increased from 0 to over 5,000 in some winters. Of course, there was one possible solution to the problem of how to conserve the wildlife of Amberley wild brooks, and that was to simply buy the land as a nature reserve and take control of the sluices. To the credit of the Sussex Wildlife Trust, this is what they tried to do starting in 1963. 57 years ago, they bought part of the wild brooks for £5 from the Duffield family. It was the Trust's very first nature reserve and a remarkably far-sighted acquisition, showing just how important they have always regarded the site. Then, in 1997, the Trust bought a further extension of 30 acres for £30,000, which the SOS donated an impressive £10,150 towards. One of the problems with trying to manage Amberley wild brooks for wetland birds is that you need to own all of the floodplain to control the water levels. The wild brooks have always been in multiple ownership, and it only needs one owner to object to the brooks being too wet for their livestock or arable farming to prevent effective water controls for wetland birds. In 1996, the RSPB bought 133 hectares of Amberley wild brooks, including the area in this photo, which is adjacent to the SWT land, and this led to an obvious partnership between the two organisations. It was because the RSPB already had the staff and machinery in the valley that it was agreed that the RSPB would manage the Trust's land at Amberley. It was Tim, who was always a good team player, who helped to set up and manage this partnership, which was a great success. The production of the management plan for the wild brooks was more complex than the original plan for Pulborough, because the wild brooks were already designated for plants and invertebrates, as well as breeding and wintering birds, and so careful consultation with both the Trust and Natural England, as well as specialist naturalists, was required to produce and implement the management plan. Though exacting, this was not a problem for Tim, who had local experience, a sound knowledge of how to manage for all wildlife interest, and the support from a good team of wardens and ecologists. The second reserve is Waltham Brooks, which the Sussex Wildlife Trust bought for the sum of £50 from the Church Commissioners in 1976. Waltham Brooks is separated from the wild brooks by the River Aran. It's not an easy site to manage because it was common land, and for many years the Trust had no control of the grazing. However, despite these problems, it was for many years the only viable wetland reserve north of Arundel, with open water and therefore the regular wintering roost site of the Buick swans in the valley, along with many other waterfowl, all crammed into this small area of just 117 acres or 47 hectares. The good news is that the Trust have now finally gained control of the grazing, and despite high levels of disturbance, it can still hold large numbers of wetland birds, especially when they've been disturbed from one of the other two areas. Waltham Brooks is managed by Jane Wilmot from the SWT, and I'm grateful to her for this information. My own involvement in this story began in 1986, when the RSPB decided to appoint regional reserves managers manage existing reserves throughout England. Shortly after I was appointed, I was told to concentrate on acquiring new nature reserves in the region, and preferably ones that were good for visitors as well as birds. This was because the South East region, which included Greater London, had far more members than any other region, and there were very few existing reserves, and most of them were not designed for visitors. It was in 1987 that I first visited Pulborough Brooks. The owner at the time wanted to give the North Brooks to the RSPB as a nature reserve as part of a planning gain deal. In exchange, he expected the planning authority to grant him permission for all sorts of inappropriate developments. Although it was clear this was not a viable offer, I took the opportunity to have a good look around the North Brooks, and although it was dry and completely overgrown, as you can see in this rather poor photo which I took at the time, I could see we should be able to control water levels, and so it might have potential. On its own, the North Brooks was about 180 acres or 75 hectares, and therefore too small to be a reserve. In those days, we came up with a rule of thumb that a wetland reserve should be about 500 acres or 200 hectares to justify the necessary investment in staffing and equipment, etc. I then walked through to the South Brooks, which was not part of the offer, and I remember standing roughly in the middle and looking up to Upperton's barn and thinking what an excellent visitor centre it would make for the whole site. Later on, I went back to the same spot with John from lots of superb drawings he gave to the SOS. John was a lovely chap and a wonderful wildlife painter, and I commissioned him to paint this painting for the article I wrote for the Birds magazine, as it was called then, announcing the new reserve. You can still see this painting in the visitor centre. Note how overgrown the brooks are, and if you look carefully you can just see the backs of the cattle hidden in the grass. I kept in touch with local people and learnt in 1988 that the whole site had changed hands and that it was now owned by bankers who might be willing to sell parts of the site but not the barn. A lot of things have to happen very quickly when you are looking to buy a nature reserve. My first task was to check the water abstraction licence and water quality to ensure we could secure the water we needed. It was all right then, but sadly today the river water is too polluted to use on the reserve. The next step was to work with our ecologists and wet grassland research experts to assess which key species we were likely to attract and if the numbers would be sufficient to justify acquiring the land as a reserve. Essentially, we were seeking to support nationally important numbers of key wetland birds, defined as 1% of the national total, which required specialist wet grassland habitat management. The list we came up with was the following: wintering wildfowl, shoveler, pintail, widgeon, teal and Buick swan, and wintering waders, lapwing, ruff and whimbrel on passage. Once we were confident that the birds would come, we then had to consider managing the reserve for people. It was not too difficult convincing the RSPB Director of Education that, given a little work, the barn could be an education centre with a classroom. Nor was it much of a problem convincing marketing colleagues to agree that we could fit a viable shop and tea room into the barn, based on the experience at Leighton Moss in Lancashire. I then met with local planners to check that we could get planning permission for the change of land use required, together with permission for a visitor centre, birdwatching trails and hides, a car park and road access. Road access proved to be the most serious problem, and in the end I had to design and draw up plans for the new road access in a single day in order to get approval in principle from the planners before we exchanged contract. After many meetings, visits and reports, we made an offer and it was accepted in January 1989. The next task was to generate public support and appeal for funding. There were many meetings with the public, parish, district and county councils and the media, and all responses were very positive, and we received good radio and TV coverage as well as newspapers. When we met with Horsham District Planning Committee, they not only expressed great enthusiasm but also offered to pay for the car park, which the County Council then offered to design for us. The County Council also provided us with thousands of local provenance native trees. This was in the good old days when local authorities had the funds to support nature conservation. On one day in 1990, we had a large and very enthusiastic turnout of volunteer tree planters, seen here. We put up fences and planted several thousand trees in one day, and we even did some on-site training when we found a few trees were planted upside down. The idea was to screen all visitor trails so that when you looked out from the centre or from the viewpoints, you'd not see other people and so maintain the illusion of relatively empty countryside. In 1990, we appointed Tim Calloway as site manager, and then the work of creating a wetland reserve really got underway. Managing nature reserves for birds and wildlife requires skill, knowledge, experience, and a great deal of hard work. Over the last 32 years, there have been a huge number of volunteers as well as staff doing this work. So many volunteers have put in so much effort over the years that to give them the thanks and praise they deserve would take up most of this talk. But we can at least remember them with gratitude when we visit and enjoy the reserve. What made managing Pulborough Brooks far more difficult but much more rewarding was the design and creation of the centre. The trails, hides and viewpoints that have enabled hundreds of thousands of visitors to get close to nature. Pulborough is one of the most visited RSPB reserves in the country, where you can get really close to wildlife without causing disturbance or damaging the environment. I personally think that helping so many people to enjoy, understand and care for wildlife is the great achievement of Pulborough. Following the original land purchase at Pulborough in 1989, there were two subsequent extensions bought in the 1990s. These were the remaining part of the South Brooks and Wigan Holt Common, which was a conifer plantation, which has since been restored to heathland. Although Wigan Holt Common, which is not actually legally a common, is only a relatively small area of heath, it was an important extension because it could support breeding species such as nightjar and woodlark, which visitors would appreciate, and it was also a good site to demonstrate how heathlands can be restored by simply removing conifer plantations on appropriate soils. We also created a number of excellent dragonfly ponds, where I even watched a passing black stork dropping in a couple of years ago. RSPB reserves were always acquired in order to deliver targeted numbers of certain key bird species, but once we acquired them, we always looked carefully to find out what other species of importance occurred, and we would then devise a management plan that would care for all the plants and animals of conservation concern. At Pulborough, it was relatively easy because there was little previous conservation interest to constrain management. By controlling grazing and water levels, Tim and his team were able to manage conditions for both wintering and breeding waterfowl, and the results were truly remarkable. In the first 10 years, they recorded 215 bird species on the reserve, and in some years, in excess of 20,000 wintering wetland birds. I was hoping to show you a detailed breakdown of the wintering bird numbers for the three reserves, but unfortunately, because of COVID, I've not been able to access all the data I wanted. However, I have produced graphs showing the number of key wintering wetland bird species over the last 53 years in the valley between Arundel and Pulborough using the BTO Wetland Bird Survey WEBS report online. Thanks to Helen Crabtree, our local BTO representative, I've been able to check the locations of this data over the last 5 years, and it shows that all of the teal, pintail, lapwing and Buick swans in the valley were confined to these three reserves, and that 98.6% of the widgeon and 98.1% of the shoveler were also confined to these three reserves over the last 5 years. These two graphs compare the wintering peak counts for shoveler and widgeon. Before I comment on the birds, I should just like to explain a few points. Firstly, the vertical scale on these graphs are different, so beware of direct comparison. The key thing to look at is the timing of the peaks. Secondly, I have put the letter PB below the horizontal timeline to show when Pulborough Brooks was acquired, so you can see when it started to have an effect. Lastly, I have drawn horizontal lines across each graph to show the current nationally important threshold, which is 1% of the average UK peak total for the last 5 years. The interesting thing about thresholds is that they change depending upon the average number of birds over the previous 5 years. One of the effects of creating a number of new reserves like Pulborough is that many wildfowl are increasing, and so the threshold increases. For example, shovelers used to occur in internationally important numbers at Pulborough, but as the UK numbers have increased, so the threshold has risen above the level of the current local population. As we create more successful nature reserves supporting increasing numbers of wildfowl, so importance thresholds will increase, resulting in individual reserves seeming less important. It's a case of more eggs you can get into an increasing number of baskets, so the less important each basket becomes. Looking at these two graphs, they compare shoveler and Widgeon Peak wintering numbers since '57. Although shoveler numbers declined in the last 2 years shown, you can see they're still above nationally important threshold. This means that shoveler is one of the two most important wildfowl in the valley. Looking at the Widgeon Graft, earlier I showed you Tim's graph of Widgeon numbers between 1957 and 2002 for Pulborough and Ambley Wildbrooks, and you can see they have continued to do well over the last 20 years. Although numbers dropped in the last 2 years shown, they've been doing quite well in most years and have certainly increased this winter. Effect after year 23 is particularly notable. Looking at similar graphs for teal and pintail, there's a similar pattern. Teal numbers in the valley look pretty healthy. However, pintail is the one target duck species which has decreased nationally, but numbers in the Aran Valley are holding up to some extent. Last year, they were below the 200 threshold, but this winter they've certainly been well above. So you can see that there's a second threshold shown, marked as II, which is international importance. Pintail have exceeded this in the past, and it would only take some 400 more birds to reach international importance again. So this is the second most important wildfowl species in the valley. Looking now at Buick Swan, the following graph shows their numbers in the Aran Valley over the last 57 years. And below that, I've placed the graph showing the total English population over a similar period. You can see numbers have been decreasing considerably in New England since the late 1980s, but numbers in the valley have decreased less than the national average. However, they are still decreasing, and there are various theories to explain this. It may be due to hunting pressure on their migration routes, global warming resulting in more of them wintering on the continent, or simply that they now prefer improved grassland and are less likely to feed in nature reserves. Let's now look at wintering and passage waders. Lapwing numbers have declined significantly since the 1990s, perhaps because more remain on the continent as a result of milder winters, but there they will still have on average over 3,000 each winter. Two important species in the 1990s were ruff and wimbrel. Wintering ruff have decreased in numbers in the UK over the last 15 years, but the numbers in the valley are only just below the threshold, and so they're therefore still important. Wimbrel is interesting because numbers recorded on migration in the UK have actually increased over the years, but they stopped coming inland for some reason some 20 years ago. Their call used to be a common sound at night in the valley in the 1990s. Two new species now occur in nationally important numbers in the valley. They are green sandpiper, with a current average of 11 birds, some 3 times more than the threshold, and black-tailed godwit, which was the first recorded in 1991 and has exceeded the nationally important threshold for the last 7 years. Having discovered the valley, it seems they're coming back in increasing numbers, and we do know that they are quite mobile, moving between Pulborough and Ambley and also the coast. Wintering birds' numbers may change from year to year for many reasons, such as flooding, cold weather, land use and habitat changes, disturbance, and now global warming. Despite these changes, we've seen from the graphs that our wintering wildfowl numbers are fairly healthy at present. It was the huge increase in wintering waterfowl in the 1990s which resulted in the designation of Pulborough Brooks as an SSSI in 1998, and then the European designation of SPA and the international designation of Ramsar site, which was extended to all 3 sites, which was made the following year in 1999. In addition to priority wintering birds, we originally identified 3 breeding wader species as a high priority to retain in the valley, because if they cease breeding, it can be very difficult to get them back, and all 3 were declining as breeding species in the region. Unfortunately, you will see from these graphs that we did not do very well, especially in the last 20 years. Looking at them in turn, starting with lapwing, which incidentally are already displaying in the valley. The good news is that we are holding on to a small population in the valley. Note that the red indicates the wild brooks and blue the Pulborough population. Looking at redshank, they're not doing well on the wild brooks or Waltham brooks, but you can see here that they are doing slightly better at Pulborough, although they have declined since the 1990s. Snipe, although we still see good numbers of snipe in winter, sadly we've lost them as a breeding species from the valley, just as we have from pretty much all of southern England. Both the RSPB and the SWT are taking these declines in breeding waders very seriously. Last year, the SOS gave a grant to the SWT for £21,895 for a breeding wader project to help the reserve reverse the declines, which follow national trends. The funding provides extra resources to manage difficult to reach areas, rush and tussock sedge control, scrub control, difficult to reach areas, topping wet fields, mink monitoring and vertebrate studies. The RSPB are also looking at options including electric fences to deter ground predators. There is some good news of breeding waders, within 2 new species now breeding at Pulborough Brooks. Little ring plover were first recorded in 1991, and 1 or 2 pairs have attempted to breed in 13 of the last 14 years. Avocet, 1 to 2 pairs have bred for the last 3 years. To optimise breeding and wintering bird numbers, we need as much control of grazing and water levels as possible. Too little will not attract wintering wildfowl. Too much may delay waders breeding and reduce available food for raptors, waders and owls. Too little grazing will reduce suitable breeding habitat, and too much may risk trampling, which recent studies has shown is a more serious problem than we used to think. These are some fallow deer on Amberley wild brooks, which may be a part of the problem. So where are we now? Today we can look back over the last 58 years at Amberley wild brooks and 45 years at Waltham brooks and congratulate the SWT on securing these areas and retaining wildlife in the face of all the changes. It was the addition of Pulborough Brooks 32 years ago which resulted in raising wintering bird numbers to internationally important levels and brought the relative security of SPA, Ramsar and SAC designations. The key to this success is that the 3 sites operate together so that if any one site is disturbed, the wildfowl have an alternative refuge close by. There have been many changes over the last 30 years. Climate change brings us more species from the south, such as little cattle and great egret, as well as little ring plover. Then we have new species introductions, bringing us red kites and white storks. I took this poor photo on my phone through my scope. It was at Pulborough Brooks, and one of the birds was thought to come from France because it had no ring. And perhaps, who knows, in the future we should be getting white-tailed eagles. We've certainly had wild ones in the past at Amberley Wild Brooks. In addition, there has been the results of species protection work throughout the UK in recent years, which has resulted in impressive increases in buzzards, marsh harriers and peregrines, but there is still some work to do for hen harriers. I've concentrated on wetland birds in this talk because they were our priority and I simply don't have time to look at the other 200 plus bird species recorded on the reserve over the years. However, I have gone through the list and made a list of some of the more interesting breeding birds which have occurred in this time. This table shows Birds that have first bred since 1991. Little ring plover, gargony, woodlark, Chetty's warbler, buzzards, firecrest, avocet and Egyptian goose. There have also been some predictable losses in line with national decline in some species. This table shows these breeding losses and records that last year they bred tree sparrow in 1988, turtle dove 1996, little owl 2008, yellow wagtail 2008, grey partridge 2013 and snipe 2015. As an old conservationist, I've fought many battles over the years, and I must say it's not easy to be optimistic about the future. But what I do know is that we must keep on trying. There are many serious problems facing the Aran Valley and the wider countryside beyond. Too many agri-environment schemes in the past have delivered little or no public or wildlife benefit. Most schemes have not been sustainable, and the payments cost prior wildlife habitat, and so conservation bodies like the trusts and the RSPB cannot afford to buy them. One promising sign is that our present governments say that they recognise that the agri-environment funding has not delivered sufficient wildlife benefit, and they plan to do something about it. Only time will tell if they will. Successive governments have made drastic cuts to nature conservation spending. Approximately half of all the SSSIs in the country are in unfavourable condition. Pulborough Brooks is in favourable condition, and both Waltham Brooks and Amberley Wild Brooks are recovering from unfavourable condition, according to Natural England. However, what I find really worrying is that Natural England have not assessed the condition of Amberley for more than 10 years because of staff shortages. Over the years, I've worked closely with the staff of both Natural England and the Environment Agency, and I know they mostly do their best, but they simply do not have the funding to do their job properly. There's a similar problem with local authorities who've had to hand over many areas of conservation land to wildlife trusts and the RSPB because they can no longer afford to manage them due to government cuts. So charitable trusts have taken on what should be a government responsibility to manage some of our most treasured areas for wildlife. Well, I'm coming to an end of this talk, and I hope I have explained a little about why the Aran Valley is an exceptional place for wildlife, and I hope you agree we will all need to be vigilant if we want to keep it special. Special wetlands should not be so unusual. There's no reason why agri-environment funding should not fund similar wetland projects for wildlife in all of our river valleys and floodplains. The Ada, Lewis Brooks, the Cookmere, Pevensey Levels all have much greater wetland wildlife potential, and we should be demanding that our government delivers this. The SOS is an excellent organisation which records and studies wild birds in Sussex. They assist conservation, they encourage the study of birds and ornithological science, and the protection of wild birds and their habitats. The SOS record in the Aran Valley is particularly impressive, with 7 grants given to the SWT and the RSPB over the last 22 years, to a total of £64,695. Well, I said at the beginning of this talk, it was in memory of Tim Calloway, who did so much to protect and enhance the wildlife in the Aran Valley, as well as many other places. We can't all be a Tim Calloway, but we can all do our bit. Thank you for listening.
Thanks a lot, Tim. That was fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. So I'm going to pass over to Richard Kaiser in a second to do some Q&A. I have to say it was such a comprehensive and well presented talk, a model of clarity, that I think there are perhaps fewer questions than there might otherwise be. But thank you, Jim. And I think all of us visiting these reserves will have a much better understanding in future of the commitment and effort that went into their creation, and indeed is still going on for their ongoing management. So let me pass over to Richard.
Hello.
Stop your screen share, please, Jim, if you can. Thank you.
Hold on. Can you see me okay? Oh, stop share.
Stop screen share.
You want me to stop screen sharing?
Yes.
Hold
Yes,
on.
please. Yeah.
Right.
Done it. Cool.
Right. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, that was a great talk. Number of questions in here. The first one, Jim, is about you mentioned that the river water is now too polluted to use on Pulborough Brooks. Why is that?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, but apparently two factors. One is there's a significant amount of sewage that gets into the river. The other is that there's agricultural runoff of various chemicals. But you'll need to get a local expert to explain any more detail than that.
So, so really, that goes on the other question related to that. What needs to be done to make the water better? Basically, the runoffs, etc., have got to be cut back.
Yes, basically, it's a political problem. It's a lack of political will. It's a lack of funding, I think, for the Environment Agency who are dealing with it. And I think what we need to do is to campaign to local politicians and anyone who will listen to say that this really isn't acceptable in this day and age.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, another question here. You referred to the fact that there are some disturbances issues on the brooks. Can you elaborate on those, please?
It's a difficult one. Various factors come into play. It's also to do with whether there's staff and volunteers able to control disturbance. Not hugely a problem, but for example, I often go and look over Amberley Wild Brooks, and quite often there's a dog running around, and that can then spook the deer that run all over the place, and it can move quite large numbers of birds. So that's part of the problem. And dog walkers letting their dogs off the lead, certainly at Waltham Brooks, can be an issue as well.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions about the deer. The deer were wild, were they?
Well, they originally escaped from Parum, where you'll notice that they're the black form of fallow deer that we get, and they escaped apparently in the past, and I think it was the '87 storm where a lot of them got out. They've increased in number throughout the valley, and some owners are controlling them, but I think there is some concern that, especially if they're being chased by dogs, if there's 100 or more deer trampling through an area where waders may be breeding, then the risk of trampling has got to be quite significant.
And do you think that's likely to lead a question here? Are the fallow deer likely to be removed from Pulborough Brooks because of the danger of the problems they're caused by trampling?
Well, at Pulborough, there has been some control in the past, and the numbers aren't as high as they used to be, but there's certainly quite high levels in the valley. And I know that conservationists are looking at this and discussing what kind of level is appropriate. But I'm not personally involved in that process, so I can't tell you much more.
Okay. You quoted quite a lot of figures there about numbers of birds, etc. Question, do the numbers from WWT Arundel feed into the overall status and stats that you're quoting on the valley?
Yes, the counts that I gave you cover the BTO area, which includes the Wildfowl and Wetland Trust. How much, whether they put all the birds in, the species that we're looking at tends to be ones that occur further up in the valley, but overall that's all part of the count area. But I'm not personally one of the counters, so I can't give you more detail than that. Okay.
Another question here, is there any detrimental impact of the growing populations of Canada and grey-lag geese?
Not that I'm aware of. If anything, I think, this last winter, which has been exceptional with all the white fronts that came in, and they would very readily come in and join with the greylags and the Canada. So maybe it might even be a good thing. They certainly eat a lot of grass, but that may not be a bad thing because they may be maintaining areas of grass suitable for widgeon and other wildfowl. So I personally don't have a problem with them.
Okay. And a question here, has managing the wetland for water birds been detrimental to any other species of breeding birds?
Not that I'm aware of. If water levels are particularly high, then ground nesting, but it might affect ground nesting birds. But that's, if anything, it's not what management is seeking to do. The management wants to control the water levels to make sure that you don't get extensive flooding. So I can't think of examples of it affecting breeding birds.
Okay. There's been a lot of talk about sort of rewilding areas. Would you support a wilder Aran Valley? For example, is it suitable for beavers? And how do you think the local farming landowners would react to that?
Well, wilding or rewilding is very interesting, and I think what the Knepp estate has been doing near Horsham is very impressive indeed. But there is an issue here, and that is that if you want to retain breeding waders, for example, then you've got to have very careful control of the habitat. You need to control the water, you need to control the... So simply letting it go wild isn't the answer. So I think there are many parts of the country where rewilding would be highly recommended, but not necessarily in the River Valley, in the Aran Valley. I think one of the points that I hoped came across from my talk is that for a very, very small area, Pulborough Brooks managed to retain sufficient birds for it to become internationally important. But if you look at the extent of the 3 reserves I've been talking about, they're only a tiny fraction of the Aran Valley. And they represent in many ways the equivalent of an ark. They're holding on to all the birds that we need to hang on to. It would be lovely if we could turn it back to how it was 50, 100 years ago, but the important thing is we retain the birds we've got until such time as the whole of the valley could be restored.
The Aran Valley is obviously very important for birds. What are the most important non-bird species in the Aran Valley? Bless you.
Sorry. Well, the one species that's the most important species is the Whirlpool Snail, for which the SAC notification for both Pulborough and Amberley has been given. So that's officially the most important species, but it is, as I pointed out, an incredibly diverse area, and it's a difficult area. I mean, it's very important for invertebrates, it's important for its plants, Amberley especially, for its plants, and also mammals, the water vole, harvest mice, quite a whole range of species. So I guess it would start a debate as to say which are the most important, but the wonderful thing is that it's got all of these species.
Lovely. And a question here, how are nightingales doing at Pulborough?
Pretty well. I'm not sure what the total count last year was. I think 7 or 8 pairs, which is quite good. They're doing fairly well in the valley too. I do some surveys in the valley, and there's quite good numbers around the edge of both Waltham Brooks and Amberley Wild Brooks as well. So they're quite good numbers in the valley, and the best of all, I can actually hear them at night if I leave the window open, because I live just a stone's throw from the Waltham Brooks.
Lucky old you. Question in here. You mentioned about dogs off the lead being a problem at Waltham Brooks. Is there any way to make that illegal and forbid people from walking their dogs there?
Well, no is the short answer. I mean, dogs should be under close control. Whether close control remains on a lead or not is debatable. But I know the Trust try hard and they do ask people to keep them on the lead. But so many people just let the dogs off and they run off, and you can see them chasing wildfowl, and also livestock. So when they've got grazing animals there, it is a problem. And I'm not sure the law can adequately deal with it. And it's a real headache for all conservation bodies trying to manage these areas of land.
Okay, thank you. Question in here. Are the conservation designations such as SSSI, SPA, SAC, etc., likely to be affected now that the UK has left the EU?
That's a very good question, and my answer is I don't know. but I do fear for the worst. I certainly know in the past the government were constrained by SPAs because they didn't have the courage to stand up and oppose the EU. But now we're no longer a part of the EU. I do worry that in the future some important areas may be lost or compromised.
Okay. And another question here, with the COVID pandemic, have you seen any significant impact at all three sites from the changes in the visitor patterns?
Well, certainly with Pulborough Brooks, the centre's been closed for quite long periods of time, but it's still, the reserve is still open, and there's quite a few people who go there. I tend to spend more time looking at Waltham Brooks and Amberley because it's closer to me. And if anything, I've actually noticed more people walking out in the countryside, but not necessarily causing a problem. And as long as they don't go out and or let their dogs off a lead, then it hasn't really been a problem.
And a question here, how are cuckoos doing?
Not too bad. In fact, I think there were 3 different males calling recorded at Pulborough this last year. And certainly I hear them regularly from my garden when they're calling. I'm not sure exactly what's going on. They certainly occur on Waltham Brooks and on Amberley, and occasionally they seem to fly across to the River Rother Valley as well. So we're holding on to some, but they're not many.
Okay. And a question here about grasshopper warblers. Are they present and making a comeback?
They've declined. I tried to recall because I looked at the breeding figures recently. They've declined slightly, but they're still in the valley, and there's still something like 4 or 5 males reeling. So they do occur, and they particularly like the dense overgrown areas as well. So, but yeah, they seem to be all right.
Okay. And final question here. Is it possible to control predators like fox and badger?
Well, that's a big question. One of the things I know that the RSPB is looking at is electric fencing, and there are a number of examples in various places where it's working successfully. One particularly good example is at Peckham Harbour, where they put it around the island, and the breeding terns there are doing very well indeed. So it's a fairly expensive solution, but it does work, and that's something that I know they're thinking about.
Okay, okay. I think that really we've oh, one last question in here. Is a saline change modelled with climate change?
Salinity. I'm not sure. I mean, of course, the River Aran through past these 3 reserves is tidal, and there will be saline water as a wedge, but underneath the freshwater. But to what extent that's always been the case, I guess it's with sea level rise, and if rivers rising, if the river becomes higher, and also if there's increased rainfall, so flooding is more frequent, then it might have an effect, but I'm not aware of it having been an issue in the past.
Okay, fine. Jim, thank you very much. There's been a very wide variety of questions, and thank you very much for answering them all. Over to you, Mark.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard, for posing them, and thank you, Jim, for answering them. I was worried at one stage there didn't seem to be many questions, but everybody was so enthralled by your talk, Jim, that they didn't ask them and to type them in until the talk had actually ended. They were absolute masses. So thank you for getting through them all. Yeah, well, I think we've all been entranced by what you've told us about these lovely areas, and I'm sure whenever we go again, we'll think of your talk and all the effort that's gone into creating the reserve. So thank you, Jim, very much indeed again. So just to say as we finish that the next talk is by Dr. Mark Eaton, who's the Secretary of the Rare Breeding Birds panel. That's this time next week, and he'll be talking about the work of the panel. So thank you all very much indeed. If you'd like to make a donation to the SOS, you can see from Jim's talk that it goes to very good conservation causes, and you may want to join the SOS if you're not a member. So with that, thank you very much indeed, Jim. Again, if people could give you a round of applause, they would, I'm sure. But thank you very much, and enjoy your evening, everybody. Good night.
Okay, thanks very much. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.